Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the CrossWinds Church More Than Sunday podcast. We're glad you're here. We're trying a new thing today where we're going to do a series of episodes on basically tough faith questions, and we got a great one emailed in. And so I have invited Matt VanGent, our executive pastor, and Jodie Tey, our associate pastor, to be on the podcast with me, and we're going to all do our best to try and answer this. So hope you enjoy. Well, hello, everyone. I am here with Jodie Tey. Wait, Dr. Jodie Tey, in light of what we're going to talk about today. Not a medical doctor. Feel like I always need to say that just in case anyone has an emergency. And Matt VanGent, our executive pastor. Jodie, our associate pastor. Matt, our executive. Welcome, guys.
Good to have you.
I don't think the three of us have podcast together yet, have we?
Mm-mm.
We haven't.
It's kind of fun.
Great.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
I love talking to you guys. So
here is what is going to be the theme behind this podcast and really where we're going. I'm hoping to do a couple different episodes with you guys. Somebody sent me a great email about 6 days ago, and it said, hey, there are a bunch of tough faith questions that I've got, and it would be really cool for you guys to do an episode of trying to answer these questions as some of our pastors. And so I grabbed the smartest people I could find, and it's the two of you guys.
No pressure.
And thought we could hear your answers. And I'm going to read one of those questions today, and then I'm thinking what we'll do is if this goes well, we'll come back and we'll do a couple more based on some other questions that this person sent me. Before I do it, can we just say that we're all going to disagree on the answers to these things? Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
That we will disagree?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I think the nature of tough questions is that there are thousands of years of different people who are faith leaders trying to answer them, all with very different thoughts and angles as they answer. And doesn't mean that one is more right than the other. I mean, maybe one is right, but we'll not know who's right. That's kind of the way this goes. So it's okay that you might find yourself getting three different answers from the three of us on any of these questions we talk through.
Yes, because we agree to disagree. Absolutely. It's one of our values at CrossWinds. We will agree to disagree, even on our staff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for me, when I wrestle with these types of questions, for me, it's the process that is valuable and important more so than the answer I come to, in part because these are hard questions without clear answers. And so my answers to these questions, my answer to what we're talking about today has changed over the years, but the process has been really valuable. And I try to remind myself to stay humble as I think through these things and hold them with an open hand, knowing that there's a very good chance that next year, or maybe even by the end of this podcast, I'll think differently.
Yeah. That's a really good way to put it. In fact, I think Matt changed his answer since yesterday when we first talked about doing this. Matt, I think as soon as you knew you were going to have to go public, you were like, I better.
Well, it's such a tricky question that has so many different ways of coming at it that the more I started to think about it more thoroughly, I'd say my answer got more nuanced.
No, it's all good, man. I'm making fun, but the truth is that's all of us. I think all of us have any number of ideas, and then at some point when you go, oh wait, people might hear this, I better really think about this. For not that that's even what happened with you. You might have a variety of answers to the question we're going to look at today.
I do. Yeah. I have a few.
Right. Okay, let me read the question. All right.
Okay. Go.
And I decided it would probably not be good to read who they're from. So you'll have to tell your husband we're answering his questions, Jodie.
Okay, got it.
I'm just kidding. It's not. So here's a question. Evil dwelling in the world and people sinning explains injustice, crime, bad things, atrocities. So that's the first point they're making, that we often hear there's evil that lives in our world. And by the way, we all sin as well. And so that is why there's injustice out there and there's crime and there's a lot of bad things happening to good people, all of that. Okay, here's the question. But how do you explain disease? And this person puts parenthetically cancer, ALS, etc. Disease is not a consequence of our free will or evil, and it would make one think that God does cause suffering. So, what we want to talk a little bit about today is disease and how we make sense of that in our understanding of God being a good, loving God. And is he the one that is causing it by not doing anything about it? So, I think we probably got a few different answers. Maybe it would make sense to begin by just telling you some of what we've heard out there before we each start to give you what we think might be our version of a right answer on this. Does that seem like a good idea, you guys?
Yeah, go for it.
Sounds good.
So, for me, one of the things that I've heard a lot before as an answer to this, and it's not my favorite answer, I'll be honest with you, is right. God is loving. He is compassionate. He does promise to heal us. He will heal us someday. That disease is there, and because he's so against suffering, he guarantees he's going to heal us. But even if you don't get healed now, you will someday. Have you guys heard that answer before? And do you tend to agree with that, or how does that fly with you as you think about that one?
Well, I'll get into a little bit of that more when I elaborate on my perspective on this. But I think inherent in that response is the idea that God could heal us from it right now, but doesn't. Either doesn't want to, or whatever reason, God could but doesn't. And that doesn't fit with how I understand God.
Yeah, I think what is underlying in that concept, and what I like about it, is this idea that there is a heaven that is coming. There is some other experience outside of the one we live in here on a world that is fallen and not ideal. So there's a lot to be praised in that approach. But where it starts to get problematic is in the idea that this very vicious thing that somebody might be experiencing right now, that God's kind of cool with it. He's all right for you to go through, and I'll put this in quotes, a living hell on earth, because he's got heaven for you later.
Yeah, that's a tough one to swallow as you're watching somebody die of cancer, or as you're watching human suffering play out. That's not a picture of the kind and loving God that we know. Him sitting back with his arms crossed saying, I could do something about this, but I'm just choosing not to, because you'll get your healing someday.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. It's a really tough thing to imagine God, who is supposed to be loving and caring, not caring so much that he'd want to do something immediately. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So that's one thing you'll hear out there. And again, I can't say that it's absolutely wrong. I'll just say it doesn't sit well with me necessarily. Another one, this is one actually, Jodie and I were together when we heard this one. Andrea was with us. We were attending a funeral together. Neither of us were officiating. And we were there. And well, maybe you can share, Jodie, what we heard.
Yeah, well, three of us are sitting there and listening to this pastor. I always watch how other people do funerals or celebration of life services, and I'm like, I'm going to take some notes and see,
That's very judgy of you, by the way.
Yeah, I know. see what they do well, what's encouraging. But I remember him talking about how this woman that we all loved and cared about had died of a massive heart attack. She had coronary artery disease. And then he started talking about our sin and how her heart attack, her death, was the result of our sin. And I thought, well, surely he doesn't mean my personal sin. And as soon as I thought it, he said, yes, it is your personal sin that is responsible for her death. And I remember looking at Chris and Andrea like, oh my gosh, did he just say that we are responsible for her death? And my reaction was, my sin did not kill her. Like, I don't believe that at all. It's not my theology. Do I believe that sin has the power to destroy, that it's destructive? Like, absolutely. Is it horrible? Does it steal, kill, and destroy? Yeah, it does. Yeah. But my personal sin was not responsible for her death. Yeah. No, I don't believe that at all.
Yeah, I think what was going on in that moment, I remember us all driving home and talking about it. And, for me, my issue with it primarily is his bedside manner. I don't know
Yeah.
that a memorial
Terrible.
service for someone in a room full of grieving people, as much as you are wanting to tell people about Jesus dying for their sin and lead them to an opportunity to receive grace, which I think is what he was shooting for there.
Hmm.
I don't know that the way to go is to tell them that the person who is deceased because you sinned last week. And that's really how it came off.
Hmm.
Where I do think he's a little bit right, though, I do think the sins of humanity entered the world, as we read about back in Genesis, and that we are living in a sinful world. As this question even said at the very top, we're living in a sinful world, and that is part of why all of this happens. Would you disagree with that, Jodie?
Say that again.
Well, I do
Because
think
we live in a sinful world that it happens.
Yeah, I do think the sins of humanity in general
Mm,
have or at the very least, Adam and Eve, as we read about them in Genesis, brought us in out of the garden into a not so wonderful world where there is disease.
well, I might push back on that.
Yeah, push
And
back
I
on it.
could
That's
push
why
back,
we're
but I
doing this.
think what my answer to that is going to take us down another path that might get us off topic a little bit. But I think I will say that I think I would put our personal human sin aside in talking about disease. And I would say that this is my theology, that I believe that there is like a saboteur, like there's a, call it what you want. You know, I grew up learning about him as Satan or Lucifer or an opposite, a destroyer. You could come up with any term that you want, the dark side, but not sin per se. But just the enemy of God out there seeking to steal and kill and destroy, that force that is sabotaging anything that God is for, he's against. So
Right.
whether it's our health or nature or, you know, the natural order of things, that I believe that can be sabotaged and has been corrupted and sabotaged. A natural process like death has been sabotaged or corrupted through disease.
Yeah. And so we have
It was
this because
someone who was sabotaging it.
there's somebody who's causing it to happen and is trying to ruin this world that we're in. Is that kind of how you'd approach that one?
Yeah. Bottom line.
What's your take on that, Matt? Do you agree with it?
I do. I think on this particular question, I think that there are a few really viable viewpoints to take towards it. And I actually do think that is a really viable way of explaining the presence of both the presence of disease in this world that is still able to maintain God's love at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess my question on that would be, and I'm just playing devil's advocate a little bit here, all right? But when you read like Genesis 3 and God casts Adam and Eve out of the garden and he says to the man and the woman some pretty significant things. I'm going to just read it here. This is Genesis 3. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat food from it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow, you'll eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. From dust you are, to dust you'll return. I mean, the concept is you are now in for a really tough life. And that's what he says to Adam. To Eve, it's about painful labor as you give birth to children, things along those lines. Doesn't that seem to suggest that because you have sinned, your world is now going to be really, really rough? And wouldn't disease fall into that category of rough? Don't answer all at once, you guys.
I know, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if cursed is the same as corrupt.
Okay.
I think something being hard is different than in being destructive.
Okay.
So I think I might draw a little bit of a line there and say that while those things are hard, they weren't meant to destroy.
Got it. And when you look at disease, and we're talking the kinds of diseases we've listed, cancer, ALS, these are destructive.
Yeah.
They are meant to ultimately, the disease itself is meant, it's trying to bring you down to nothing. It's trying to kill you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you would say the saboteur thing. I'll weigh in on that one myself in a moment. But Matt, what's your answer to this question? Again, the question: how do you explain disease? Is it a consequence? It's not a consequence of our free will or evil, so it would make you think that God is the one who caused it.
Yeah, my response relies heavily on relational theology and really this idea, this way of understanding God's love as being uncontrolling love. To say that God is a loving God means understanding that love doesn't doesn't exert force, doesn't force people or things to bend to its will. So when we look at this presence of disease, I found it really helpful to think of it in this way, that in a world that God created, that God doesn't control, there exist these dual possibilities, both the possibility for beauty and wholeness, where we see people living as God intended us to live, when we see the earth earthing the way God intended it to be. But then at the same time, because of free will, I would actually extend that freedom. We're used to thinking of free will in terms of human action, but I think if we're going to be consistent in understanding how God created the world, that free will extends to creation as well. That when God created this world, He created it and interacts with it. God is presently interacting with this world, but in a way that isn't unilaterally acting. God doesn't force His will on people or on the earth. So creating the world in this way, I think it allowed room for the possibility of choosing and behaving a different way. And whether that happened, like you were mentioning, Chris, at the beginning when sin entered the world, whether that tweaked things and set it off balance, or I'm not going to pretend to know the nuances of how that happens. That's just been a useful framework for me to understand maybe why it exists and why God is still loving in the midst of it.
So if I'm understanding this view correctly, Matt, the concept is that God created a world that He could be relational with humans in. And as such, lots can happen in that world. It means that I can't control every aspect of what happens in that world if I'm God, or maybe I choose not to control is maybe a better way to say that.
You can. I think I've heard it said both ways. I think if you're new to relational theology, I think saying God chooses not to force His will on creation is an easier transition than to say that God can't. But either way, God, whether He chooses not to or cannot because of the nature of God's uncontrolling love, God does not.
So for Him to step in and wipe out disease would eliminate His ability, or our ability, or both of our abilities, to be relational with each other. Is that?
It would go against God's nature. If we say that God is a loving God, and if we understand love to be relational love that doesn't force one's will on someone else, then that extends to the way that God interacts with the earth, another aspect of God's creation. If God is going to act true to God's character, then it precludes the possibility of unilaterally acting like that.
What do you do with, let me use an analogy, and maybe this is a faulty analogy. And so if it's flawed, just say it. But it's my kids, right? Let's say one of my kids has a disease and I want to have this relationship with my kid, and I have the power to wipe out that disease with my daughter. But I want to have a relationship with her as well. I wouldn't think that it's against my nature to wipe it out. I would think that's actually going to help me have a stronger relationship. What am I missing in that analogy over to God and us?
I've given that one a lot of thought, and I don't have a great answer for it, because I've thought very similarly in terms of a human father like myself to to my kids? Wouldn't that be a loving thing to do? And one possibility is you kind of in your analogy, you assume that if is a big assumption. If I had the power to eradicate that disease, wouldn't the loving thing be to do that? Well, one way of understanding relational theology would say that God doesn't have that power, that because of God's nature, because his foundational attribute is love, and this love is uncontrolling. It is beyond the scope of how God acts to unilaterally intervene this way. And I know that is going to send alarm bells ringing off
I know half of our people tuned out of the podcast
in people's ears.
but hang in there. Keep going, because I think you're onto something. So if you have more to say there, I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, let me.
Okay. Jodie, were you going to say something? You look like you're pitching.
Even saying it myself, it rings alarm bells.
Yeah.
In my own ears, because I grew up so strongly believing in this one picture of God, and now having it nuanced a little bit more, it's still hard to say something like that without thinking, oh, what am I saying?
Yeah, Jodie, did you have something?
No, I was going to ask you, I understand where, I'm starting to understand the relational theology approach, and probably we'll have to think about that a little more. Maybe we could re-podcast tomorrow and see where we're all at. We might answer differently. But I was going to ask you, where are you at on this?
Me?
Yeah.
If I could jump back in real quick before we get to Chris, there's this.
Please do.
Explains it by way of not necessarily explaining it. Let's take it to its logical conclusion. Yeah. And if we say, so let's say that God does have the power, the attribute, the character to be able to intervene and wipe out this disease. I think that raises just as big, if not bigger, questions for us when we say, well, why hasn't he yet? Why doesn't he all the time? If God is this father who can see his children suffering from a disease, then wouldn't the loving thing be to intervene and stop that disease? I think our human nature, especially if you have kids, or even if you don't, just having that love within you would say, yes, absolutely, that's the loving thing to do to stop that disease. But then when we carry that out to its natural conclusions, I think that's part of the reason we wrestle with these questions in the first place, is because we see so many instances where God didn't intervene, where God didn't stop the disease. And so we're left wondering, well, God, if you could, then why didn't you?
Yeah, I think so many of these answers that we're trying to come up with or share here, they all stem from this problem that we have created for ourselves as Christians who are trying to interpret the Bible. And the problem is, and I'm going to say this, the problem is with this theology of God is all powerful. Now, I'm not suggesting God's not all powerful. I'm just suggesting his all power as we understand it might be messed up. So, when you think of passages that would suggest that God is all powerful, here's what you think. You think of Jesus saying, with man, this is impossible. With God, all things are possible, right? Right. You think of moments where you read in the Psalms that God has abundant power and he's mighty. There's just so many of these. Well, I think what we do as humans is we read passages like that and we say, well, Jesus said, with God, all things are possible. I better try to, in my mind, make sense of what that means. And we've taken it to be God is all powerful. And we think of it like Superman is all powerful, and what that means is that he should come to the rescue with his power. That's what that looks like. What I would ask is, does God have so much power that he can even limit his power? Like he's got the power to limit his own power? That may sound like a weird question that is like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Or if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a noise? But really, could God potentially limit his own power so that he can do life with us and have relationship with us, which I think is maybe at the heart of what you're talking about a little bit there, Matt. And I wonder if we were to loosen up a little bit on our understanding of what all powerful means, that God can do all things, if it might not remove the challenges to this question a little bit. Does that make sense? What I'm saying there?
Yeah, it does. And I think it really, where I think relational theology shines is in redefining what it means for God to be all powerful.
Yeah, I think you're right. It allows him, he has so much power. Rather than it weakening the idea of God being powerful, I'd say he's got so much power that he's got more power than you think. He's got the power to limit his own way of interacting with his creation so that it can actually have free will and be the creation that he intended it to be, and have the relationship there and all of it. All right. Well, my answer to this, because Jodie, you were asking a little bit, and my guess is you were looking at the clock and going like, wow, this thing is longer than a normal podcast. We better. Mine is actually pretty similar to Jodie's in this. And here's what I've always thought. All right. You've got Jesus who comes and he says in John 10, I've come that they may have life, that they'll have it to the full. But the part that nobody seems to remember is right after that, he says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. That's the part that never gets quoted when people are talking about what Jesus says. And in my mind, I think there is a Satan that is trying to bring disease on this world. And I actually think God's agenda, Jesus' agenda, was to strike that out and to remove it from the world. And so when I get asked that question, and we get asked that quite a bit, actually, is, why is there disease, and how is that there? My answer is always, God hates this disease too. And his entire mission, Jesus' 3-year ministry on earth, was to strike out that disease and destroy it, because that disease is from Satan. Now, let's just acknowledge, the minute anyone says the word Satan, we lose everybody, right? I mean, like, have we not evolved our theology and thoughts past the idea of a guy with a pitchfork and red horns? But the fact is, you can't deny, as you read scripture, there is this being called Satan that is out to destroy the world. And I think it's unfortunate that we so quickly try to move past that, because I think really it is the heart, for me at least, of the answer to this. There is something out there trying to cause these problems. When you see cancer in someone or something else, it's because there is a destroyer that is hell-bent on destroying their life, your life, my life. And the good news is that Jesus came with a mission to wipe that destroyer out. Thoughts?
No, I think that even if you don't like the name Satan, he's referred to other ways in the Bible, like Lord of the world. So he has authority over kingdoms. He has authority over the principality of the air. Just the alternate titles give you the idea that his job is to ravage this kingdom, right? Like anything happening here, he has power over it, and he can corrupt it. And I think there is this warfare going on between God's power and that power. He's got authority here, which I don't even like saying that. Just saying God is so powerful, admitting that this force, whatever you want to call him, has power over natural processes and is going to ravage them.
It's such a weird thing as pastors, I'm sure that we don't struggle as we're talking to our friends and neighbors who are not necessarily people who are people of faith. I don't struggle telling them, I believe in God. I believe in Jesus. I even believe he died for my sins. That is not hard for me to talk about. But if they, in the conversation, somehow go, does that mean you believe in Satan? There's a part of me that is embarrassed to go, oh yeah, actually I do. But here's what I'd say. If you believe in God, this figure for good, love, trying to restore our world to its truest form, what he meant it to be, creation, everything that we talk about here at CrossWinds, he's trying to restore us. is it that hard to believe that there's something out there trying to tear it down? I mean, when you look at the pandemic we're in right now, and let's again go back to the question: things that are not caused by people sinning, but things that just happen in this world. Is it really that hard to imagine that those things are attributed to Satan? And yet there's this part of us that wants to attribute it to God. We even call them acts of God in our insurance riders. And we like, there's this thing that we want to attribute it to somebody. So I'm going to blame God for this. And I wonder why that same part of us so struggles to go, well, maybe there's another being called Satan that I could be attributing this to.
Exactly. I think like even in the New Testament, when you read stories of Jesus calming the storm, it wasn't necessarily the understanding of that as we look at that and we go, oh, Jesus controls nature. Well, the understanding of that story for people reading it back then would be that, that force coming upon them was not necessarily nature itself, but a corrupt version of nature controlled by Satan. Satan.
Yeah. Now, what do you think?
So really there was a battle going on between good and evil in that scenario, in that story.
Matt, what's your take on all this Satan talk?
Well, I think that there's a lot of evidence in the Bible that points to some sort of adversary, Satan, Lucifer, this force of evil. So I think that there's a lot of really solid ground for believing that this being exists. I think whether it's a specific being or whether it's a force of evil or whether it's whatever it might be, I do think that there's really solid biblical foundation and just experience as we look out at the world, a really solid foundation for believing that there is some force for evil that tempts us and tries to pull us away from God's best intentions for our life.
Yeah, I think for me, where I really see it is in my understanding of a lot of what was going on in between the Old Testament being written in the New Testament. And I won't take a ridiculous amount of time with this, but what we really saw in the Old Testament and understand as we read the law, especially in Deuteronomy, we get this concept that if you obey God and you do things right, you're going to get blessed. If you disobey, you're going to get cursed. And that's kind of the world that they thought that they were going to live in. And yet what they started to see happen again and again was that even good people started to have bad things happen to them, the Israelites. And what started to happen was in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, some of that happened in egregious ways. I've talked about it in sermons before. We don't have time to go into it all right now, but really a Holocaust of sorts happened in that in-between time. And people started to go, why is God like screwing up the deal that we had with him, that if we obey, he'll bless us? Because right now we're obeying and terrible atrocities are happening. And it's right around then that we start to see the idea of Satan develop in Christian or at that time Jewish theology, so that when Jesus comes on the scene, Satan is way more prominent than he was prior to Jesus. Prior to Jesus, really, the only time we really see Satan is maybe in the garden, never really calls him Satan at that moment. A couple other moments. Biggest one is the book of Job. Matt, you mentioned adversary. That's what the word Satan means. And we see this adversary in the book of Job going to God and saying, let us hurt this good guy by screwing up the deal we've made that if he's good, we'll bless him. Let's curse him instead and see if he'll still worship you. And there's a lot of thought that book is one of the last books written prior to us getting to the New Testament. And as such, I think this development, you're seeing even right there, them starting to go, wait a second, maybe there's someone else out there causing horrible things that we should be blaming instead of God. And so when Jesus comes, fascinating thing that somebody explained to me in one of my favorite classes at Fuller Seminary. I don't think they had this when you guys were there. I don't think they had this more than like once, but it was a wonderful professor named James Callis who came and taught. He was like a guest professor, a class called Apocalyptic Literature. No, wait, my bad. Intertestamental Literature and its Effect on New Testament Thought.
Wow.
Terrible title for a seminary class, but the best class I ever took. And And one of the things he talked about was Jesus comes in where there's all this other intertestamental literature that we don't have in our Protestant Christian Bible. And he basically sees what he is doing is fighting Satan every step of the way. So when he feeds a hungry person, he's fighting Satan. When he heals a blind man, he's fighting Satan. In fact, if you look at the Greek words he uses in those moments, they're words of attack against an enemy. It's not just, hey, life dealt this guy a bad hand, now you're healed, paralyzed person. It's Satan has done this to you, and now I am going to free you from what he's done, or I'm going to attack him by doing this. And then, of course, we get the final attack of Satan in his own resurrection from death, which would have also been a thing of Satan. So I tend to answer this question, I think the way that Jodie does in this, although Matt, I really like your answer, and I buy that too. But I tend to answer it from the standpoint of, I don't think disease is a consequence of our free will. I don't think it's a consequence of there being a bad thing that somebody around me has done, or injustice or crime. Disease specifically, I think there is a causer of those things. And I believe that there's this being called Satan that is doing it. And Jesus is here to, and our job as the church to be the hands and feet of Jesus is to fight against it every step of the way.
Yeah. I agree.
So I would say when you wear your mask to protect the people around you from the coronavirus, or when you stay at home and don't go to the beach, or when you do all the things you're doing, that is part of even how you're fighting Satan right now, trying to get a handle on our world as he spreads this kind of thing. Now, another question for another time is, why doesn't God just defeat Satan once and for all from any of these diseases? And we might try to answer that on another podcast, or we might look at Matt's answer and say that that's part of why.
Sure.
Right?
For sure.
Yeah. So, all right. I hope that was somewhat enlightening to anybody listening to this. If you made it this far, 36 minutes in, thank you. And we'll be back, I think, with another one of these questions at some point soon. If you don't like our answers, I don't know what to tell you. You're looking at three people who really do spend a lot of time thinking about these things. We're not saying we've got this right, but this is the stuff your pastors all think about when they are not answering easier questions, for sure. So, all right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you being on and doing this with us.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
See ya.